This is why auto mode exists. Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look back at what is presently the most highly requested turn-based strategy game I've been asked to cover, Master of Orion. This game is a prime example of the 4X strategy format taken into outer space. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the term 4X, it literally refers to a game which centers around 4 key concepts, each of which begins with the letters EX. Explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. Though to be frank, that last one can end up causing you to lose this game, unless you're exceptionally overpowered compared to your opponents, so maybe don't do that last one if you don't have to. Yeah, Master of Orion is very interesting in the fact that diplomacy is a big part of the experience, and that you can theoretically beat the game without ever engaging in a single battle. Although that's probably not going to be how it works out, as combat and war in this game are very similar to real life, in that it's less about wiping out your opponents, and more about forcing their hand into concessions without going so far as to scare any parties remaining neutral to the situation into deciding not to stay neutral. This is how the computer opponents in the game act, and it's probably how the players should act too. Also, I've been kind of dreading covering this game because, as we have clearly established up to this point in time, I am abysmally bad at strategy games. Although I'm definitely pleased to see that this game has a difficulty setting which is actually within my level of skill to survive. However, this is a very long playing game, or sort of. The way the game ends is that the leaders of the races of the galaxy convene every so often to try and decide on a high master of the galaxy who will command all of the races, and you can effectively just vote in such a way as to keep the game going or end it then and there. Not to mention, the size of the galaxy plays a role in how long the game will last as well. So if you wanted to, you can make a single gameplay session last for many, many hours. The other thing to consider, though, is that most of the game is spent tweaking your planet's production sliders and watching the numbers grow over time. So really, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to showcase much about the game without it devolving into an exploration of the various stats and races and such. Plus, I'm not really good enough at the game to do that anyways. So instead, this review will mostly be focusing on the technical aspects of playing the game. The things which work well, the things which are a bit quirky or annoying, and certain other things to be aware of lest they catch you off guard at the worst moments possible. Master of Orion was put together by a development group known as SimTex, which only really had a chance to develop a few games before getting absorbed by Spectrum Holobyte in the mid-90s, with this game being published by MicroProse back in 1993. And while what I'm about to say may seem like a mistake, this is unfortunately only a one-player turn-based strategy game. Yeah, the original release of this game had no multiplayer support whatsoever. To be fair, as we dive into this, it'll make a little more sense why adding multiplayer would have been problematic, but it's an omission which was rectified with the sequel. That's part of the reason why the sequel is so much more ubiquitous than the original. It only supports VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, while for audio, it supports most of the common devices for the time, though I should point out the sound setup program lists the quote, IBM speaker as an option, but this option doesn't actually do anything. Now, as for its current release date, the game's still commercial, and while it's technically easy to get a copy, there's a few things to watch out for, regardless of if you go for a digital copy or a physical copy. For digital copies, you can either go to GOG or Steam, but I don't have the prices listed directly in the game stats as usual, because it's kind of a complicated mess depending on what exactly you want to get, since there's 4 games in the series available on both sites. The original 3 Master of Orion games, and the modern remake made back in 2016. Which, from what I understand, is a decent game which takes after the original formula fairly well, but is otherwise nothing groundbreaking in terms of other games it was competing against at the time of its release, like Endless Space and Stellaris. Now, where it gets complicated is the fact that the collector's edition of the remake comes with the first 3 original Master of Orion games. So here's how it all breaks down. If you're not interested in the modern remake whatsoever, then it really doesn't matter if you get the game on GOG or Steam, as either way, the first 2 games are sold together for $6, and the third game is sold on its own for $10. Though my research shows that Master of Orion 3 took a gamble and changed the original formula a bit too much. So it's not that it's a bad game, but it doesn't really play like the 2 games which came before it. If you want to get the remake though, now the question is, do you also want the original games or not? Or do you want all the other art and audio extras the collector's edition comes with? Well, regardless of how you answer that, the moment the remake is involved in your decision, it's cheaper to get it on Steam, not on GOG. On Steam, the remake alone is $25 as opposed to $30 on GOG. The collector's edition is $35 on Steam and $50 on GOG. And if you buy the remake alone, but later upgrade to the collector's edition, you're paying a total of $40 on Steam and still $50 on GOG. Which is still cheaper than buying the games individually, since doing it that way, you'd be spending $41 on Steam, $46 on GOG, and wouldn't be getting any of the collector's edition extras. Basically, if you want all of it, get the collector's edition on Steam, plain and simple. As for physical copies of the original game, they're fairly easy to find, though will be mixed in with many more copies of the sequels, as you'll probably find about 6 copies of Mu 2 for every 2 copies of Mu 3 for every 1 copy of the original. Now that said, for some reason, the speculators are mostly avoiding this one, as you can generally find loose copies for around $10, fully boxed copies for around $25, and sealed copies for between $35 and $60, with there really not being any difference in value between the original floppy disk release and the later CD-ROM release. Now, a few sellers try to gouge for up to twice these values, but you just have to look up actual sales to see that no one's getting away with selling overpriced copies, since there's far too many listings with sane prices to compete against them. All of that said though, it's definitely a good idea to get a manual with your copy, since there's manual-based copy protection in the game, though it only ever comes up once per playthrough, after a solid number of in-game turns have passed. One thing that might come as a surprise when starting a new game of Master of Orion is just how few options you have. Many turn-based strategy games have a whole litany of options to adjust to set up your game world as precisely as you want, but this one only gives you 4. The size of the galaxy, the difficulty of your opponents from one of several selections, the number of opponents you'll be sharing the galaxy with from between 1 and 5, and your race as chosen from one of 10 possible race selections. Now, one thing I don't quite understand is how the choices were made in terms of the 4 galaxy sizes. Small equates to 24 star systems, medium is 48 star systems, so double the size of small, large is 70 star systems, 2 shy of triple the size of the small galaxy, and huge is 108, which is 4.5 times the size of the small galaxy. If there's a logic to these numbers, I don't know what it is. Your choice of race is also extremely important, as each race in the game gets certain bonuses, and taking advantage of those bonuses is essential in order to get an upper hand on your opposition. Well, for my run through the game, I went with the Mechlars, as their key benefit is being able to operate more factories per million colonists, which leads to producing more stuff, which is a much more generic benefit that I could wrap my mind around and understood the logic of. When the game begins, it gives you a brief overview of what each button and control on the interface does. Now, this primary interface here is where you're going to be doing most of your plotting and planning, as from here you're able to select planets to set their production levels and build orders, as well as select fleets to route them to other planets. Actually, I should probably get this one quirk out of the way right now. I may end up interchangeably referring to star systems in this game as planets, because every star system can only have one potentially habitable planet in it. So even though they're technically star systems, once a race has claimed one, all that matters is the planet in that system that's been colonized. This actually leads into another crux of the game, which takes a little getting used to, but I at least understand why it works this way. Whenever you're adjusting a balance of points between different things, such as the production levels of a planet or your research focus, changing one bar ends up affecting one or more other bars. But to help ensure these things change the way you want them to, you can click on the name of a bar to highlight it red, and in so doing, you lock the bar so that any changes made to any other bars will not affect any locked bars. It takes a bit to get used to, but works well enough once you've got it down. In fact, there's a lot of streamlining like this to try and make certain things go faster, which in the process makes them more awkward or slower to work with, only if and when you change your mind. For instance, when managing your fleets, the moment you click on a fleet, if the next thing you click on is a star system, you're basically indicating to the game that you want to move that fleet to that star system, and you now have options to accept or cancel the move. But if all you wanted to do was see what was in orbit around a planet, you have to press the cancel button following, or click on something on the map which is not a planet, like another fleet. Also, one thing I find exceedingly odd, in fact, I find this to be the one aspect of the game which is probably the hardest to get used to, is that once you tell a fleet to go somewhere and a turn passes, that fleet is now committed to reaching its destination. It will no longer be possible to turn it back around. I mean, it kind of makes sense in the context of not carrying enough fuel to make anything but a direct trip, but then this logic even applies when going to an unknown or even hostile location, and yet the fleet clearly has enough fuel to get back following, so I don't get it. Actually, let's take a moment to discuss the finer points of planet management, because this tripped me up a little in the early game until I realized what was going on, with the manual partly to blame because it contradicts itself when trying to explain this. Each planet has two production values, actual and total. The total, shown in green, parentheses, is what the planet is producing plus its share of any bonuses, while the actual amount, shown in yellow, is how much production the planet has available for the production sliders below once its share of galactic expenses are taken out of the equation. The manual not only explains this the other way around, but in its example photo, it also mislabels it as having the actual amount in parentheses instead of the total amount. The sliders below represent 5 areas of production: ships, planetary defenses, industry, ecology, and research. The more you put into ships, the faster ships are built, possibly even so fast that more than one can be built per galactic year. Defenses typically build missile bases for repelling intruders in orbit. However, this will go towards building planetary shields once the required technology is acquired. Industry goes towards building factories, as every quantity of colonists is able to operate a quantity of factories, showing either a max indicator if you're at the limit of how many factories can presently be operated, or a reserve indicator if you're at both the maximum occupancy and factories operable for the planet. Ecology will either indicate that industrial waste is being produced, that all industrial waste is being cleaned up, or that there's enough focus to either terraform the planet or increase the population faster. Finally, research simply directs production into your total research budget. And it's also important to note that production is never wasted. Any production which would have ended up wasted goes into a reserve you can access later on when necessary. Building ships is also pretty simple too. You just cycle through your ship designs to the one you want, set your production sliders accordingly, and you also have the ability to automatically relocate newly built ships to a planet under your control, which is an extremely handy feature so that you're not constantly having to issue orders for sending new ships to your front lines. The last button there, the trans button, is another one of those things which takes a little to get used to, in that there's no such thing as having to build transports for your colonists. And since it's not possible for fleets to intercept one another in deep space, the game streamlines the transport of colonists through their own special transport ships, which you have no direct control over. All you do is click the button, select how many colonists to transport, then either select a friendly planet to have them settle in with the existing colonists, or select a hostile planet to have them move in and attempt to take over, provided they make it to the surface. As sending transports to a hostile planet you haven't blockaded with your own ships is ill-advised. Though speaking of the ships, this is definitely one of the more intriguing aspects of the game, and probably a part of what helped make it as popular as it got. You get to design your own ships. The ship designer works on the concept of size and space, with 4 different sizes of ships you can build, small, medium, large, and huge, each of which has a particular amount of space available for components, each of which consumes varying amounts of space, keeping in mind that some components scale in size with the size of the ship, though some don't. While it may look a little limiting at first, keep in mind that each weapon you select can be equipped in any quantity desired. Thus, if you want to load a huge ship up with 50 puny little lasers, you absolutely could. Though you probably shouldn't. One thing I learned very quickly is that shields in this game don't have energy gauges, and instead reduce the amount of damage dealt linearly, meaning each point of shielding can be exceptionally powerful, especially against early game weapons. Seriously, do not skimp out on the shields. Though another thing that's important to keep in mind is that some weapons have a limited number of shots they can fire per combat session. Thus, even though missile weapons are generally more powerful and reliable than energy weapons, they take a couple rounds of combat to reach their mark, and once fired off, can't be used again until the next bout of combat. Thus, a ship equipped only with missiles will become a sitting duck if nothing else in your fleet is able to pick up the slack. Now, there's a few more important points to remember about designing ships as well, which are easy to forget about. The first is that there's a handful of bioweapons in the game, which are much stronger for their size than other more traditional weapons. However, if you ever fire a bioweapon against another opponent, you will immediately gain the ire of every other race in the galaxy. The second important thing to remember is that as you research the ability to land on planets with more and more hostile environments, you also need to equip that colonizing tech onto your ships and retire the older designs which couldn't handle those planets. And yeah, that's the third thing which can be a little troublesome at first, is that you can only have 6 different ship designs in your fleet at a time. If you want to make a new design, you have to scrap an old design along with every ship you own of that old design. Though you do at least get back 1/4 of the production credits used to build any scrapped ships, placed straight into your reserve. Of course, you're probably not going to be building much new without researching new technology first. The research screen allows you to see what technology is being focused on in each of the 6 main categories and allows you to adjust how much of the research budget is allocated to each, with a light bulb indicating how close you'll be to reaching a breakthrough at the end of the turn, and if you instead see a percentage, this indicates the percent chance of a breakthrough finally occurring, which can only happen after filling up the light bulb entirely. One thing I don't like, though, is that you can only see how many research points are required for each tech while selecting which tech to focus on. It'd be nice if we could actually see a reminder of how many total research points were required for each technology being focused on, since it's really easy to forget. Granted, you could always exchange technology with your neighbors or even steal it. Yet this is where the races screen comes into play. When you first start playing, you're not going to immediately have contact with any of the other races, though you can use the map screen to at least see which other races you're up against. Well, heck, the first time you encounter a particular race, it's still not going to immediately initiate contact, since first, your empire and the other empire need to dispatch ambassadors, which is a process which happens automatically once each side controls a planet close enough to the other to be reached by their normal ships, not their extended range ships. And once that's all taken care of, though, you'll now be able to initiate diplomatic relations, put together trade treaties, which do result in a reduction in production credits at first, but ramps up after a number of years to be beneficial to both sides. Plus, you can even exchange technology or offer tributes to help get in their good graces. But you shouldn't be trusting of every race you encounter. After all, you're all competitors in the race to conquer Orion. Sometimes you'll want to put some of your production budget into spying and security. By doing this, you can install spies into an opponent's empire and keep them hidden until the time is right, at which point you can set them to either commit sabotage or espionage. Though even in hiding, they will be able to report back on finer details of the race's technological advancements. Though you can also use the report screen to find out who's allied with who or warring with another, regardless of the state of your spies. Setting spies for espionage allows them to potentially steal technology and send the details back to your empire, skipping the need to research it yourself. Setting spies for sabotage will frequently allow you to commit one act of sabotage to that race at the start of your next turn, either by taking out missile bases, factories, or by inciting rebellion. In fact, when taking out bases and factories, an extra roll is made to determine if you can plant evidence to pin the sabotage on another race. Inciting rebellion, on the other hand, takes a number of turns, and once finally successful, a revolt will occur in the opponent's empire, replacing their leader and resetting all diplomatic relations for that opponent in the process. You also want to make sure to set your own security budget to root out spies sent into your empire by your enemies. However, once diplomacy falls apart, war is almost certain. Now, one thing I find kind of curious is that it's not actually possible for you as the player to declare war on another race. War can only be declared by the other races, though you are certainly capable of proposing peace treaties to end a war. And once at war, it becomes expected that the two warring powers will send fleets to each other's planets to cause havoc. When two fleets are in the same star system with no appropriate treaties between them, a battle will take place. While this battle system may seem strategic, it's really not. The open space and movements possible really do dictate battles of attrition more than battles of strategy. To that end, the actual strategy involved with battles is very simple and easily automated. Thus, there's an auto button down at the bottom you can use to have the computer intelligently conduct your ships in battle for you, allowing for battles to go much faster when you have a reasonable level of confidence in your ability to overpower your opponent. The only time you really need to go for manual control of the battle is when you're up against a sizable fleet similar in strength to your own, or when you intend to retreat. In fact, because of the whole thing of not being able to issue orders to fleets in transit, sometimes you may need to retreat just as a matter of course, due to not wanting to fight anymore following some diplomatic decision made while the fleet was in transit. Actually, the computer opponents aren't stupid about this either. If they don't think they have a chance of winning, they too will retreat almost immediately, or partway through a battle if they realize after the fact that they're outgunned. All of that said though, there is a turn limit in regards to how long a battle is allowed to last for, and in the event that the turn limit is reached, often because the protections on both sides are outpacing their damage output, it's considered an automatic retreat. Now, as the game progresses, there will be frequent news reports from GNN, the Galactic News Network. Most of the time, these reports are just run-of-the-mill comparison, showing which race has the biggest fleet, or which race has the greatest production, but on occasion, these reports will indicate some kind of event has transpired. And during my run through the game, I ended up faced with two events in my empire, the first of which saw my home world become fertile, and increasing its maximum population. The second of which, much later in the game, saw my artifacts world succumb to a radioactive disaster, halving its population maximum in the process. Now, if you ever want to see just how well you're doing, just go to the races screen and click on the status button, as this will show you graphs of how well each race is doing in various categories versus each other. In the end though, we come right back around to the game's namesake, as each race in the game has a shared belief in the existence of Orion, a planet far more lush and rich in minerals than any other ever conceived, guarded by an ancient adversary, with the thought being that whoever masters Orion will become the master of the entire galaxy. In fact, if you do find and conquer Orion, the game is set to make the other races far more likely to vote for you to become the ruler of the galaxy during any voting which takes place. Somehow, I managed to not find Orion in my entire playthrough, and given that I only missed scanning a couple star systems which were on the opposite side of the map, it's got to have been one of them. Okay, come on. This is Master of Orion, one of the quintessential turn-based strategy games of the 90s. How am I supposed to give an objective overall opinion of this thing? I mean, one thing I can say is that playing the original made me keenly aware of its shortcomings and oddities, and goes a long way to explaining why the sequel did so much better despite the first game still being exceptionally well done, just having a few quirks. Nowadays, I would say going back to this game is primarily for fans of the series who want to experience how it all started, having never played it before. But if you're not familiar with the series at all and want to give it a go, the second game improves upon the original in every way possible and has multiplayer, thus it's usually the better choice to go with. While the modern remake is also an option if you don't want to deal with some of the awkward delays and extreme streamlining of the interface here in the original. While the third game is not really the same as any of the others in the series, and is more a lesson in how not to make a sequel, even if what you're making is still a decent game in and of itself. And I'm just surprised I was able to hold my own in this game as well as I did, even with the difficulty cranked down to minimum. So the game mostly times itself out just fine, except certain aspects will go a bit slow if you set the cycles count to auto, and battle animations will go way too fast if you set cycles to max, so a fixed cycles count is in order. I went with a setting of 20,000, but didn't realize until I was faced with my first battle that this might have been a bit too high to set it to. So I'm instead going to recommend a setting of 10,000, but this is not a hard recommendation, and should be adjusted to taste to make the battle animations faster or slower as desired. Almost everything else is unaffected, save for some of the various delays which frequently occur and which may go faster with a higher cycle setting. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Up next, 2 Saturdays from now on October 25th, will be the last ADG episode of the season and of the year, episode 350. And what I have lined up is something absolutely no one is going to see coming, as it's an exploration game which appeals to me on a very deep level, to the point where hardly anyone else knows of its existence. And furthermore, it's often eclipsed by a much more dynamic and expansive program made by the same author not long following, which got way more attention, though is itself still not something you often hear talked about anymore. Not to mention, I am cheating a little, because normally I cap off coverage of, quote, ancient DOS games to the year 2000, but this one's actually from 2002. Still, none of that's going to stop me from covering it, so make sure to stay tuned to both see and play something few people ever have. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.